So, hello everybody. My name is Ana Raffo Caiado, and I'm here today to talk to you about the nuclear nonproliferation regime and the international safeguard system. You probably heard about this multiple times already, but I found it unique to give it with a different perspective. And the reason is about where I come from. I come from a developing country, from Brazil, and it's a non-nuclear weapon state, as most of you know. And I started in this business about 23 years ago, 22 to be more precise. And I, fresh out of college, out of grad school, and I had to learn how to make the connection back then between what was the policy and what was the technical parts of this international safeguards world and the nonproliferation world. It was quite hard. It took me a couple of years to make that connection. I worked first for the Brazilian Nuclear Energy Commission, and then I moved on to a regional safeguard system called ABAC. It stands for Brazilian Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control of Nuclear Materials. And I stayed there for 11 years. And that's where I almost became, I had to learn what was international safeguards. And I had to put the both policy and technical together, because I didn't have what you are having today, which is being presented to you and making sure that you are introduced to the subject from all of the angles possible. So my presentation more or less gives you my experience in how do you look for the goal, what are you searching for, and how do you implement what is being asked in terms of policy goal to support the technical measures that you're being implemented. Later on, just to move on a little bit, talking about myself, after all those years working for this bilateral safeguards organization, I came to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and I've been here for more than 8 years now, working in international safeguards, basically in international collaboration. So we implement technical collaboration projects with many countries that are partners of the Department of Energy. All of these projects are technical projects, and they are related to addressing a policy or a technical goal. So let's move on a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about, and hopefully some things will fall into place. By now, you probably heard some of the presentations that were given before. Don't be afraid that the subject is repetitive, and as I said, the more repetitive, the better. And this was my way of understanding how all of this came together. So some of the things that I'm going to present here, you're going to say, I've already saw this, but if you follow the reason and the sequence of slides, you'll see that they fall into place. I have a next presentation also that will continue with this, so hopefully you'll have a better understanding of the flow of the subject. So let's talk a little bit about the nuclear nonproliferation regime. And I always like to start, I'm not a lawyer, but I love international law. And one of the things, I love to start my presentations with this slide, just to make an emphasis of how important international law is for the nuclear nonproliferation regime. Everything is documented by means of international agreements, signed by head of states. Any changes most likely have to go through countries' congresses and senators and all of the political approval processes. So international agreements is the key of grounding the regime. The regime, and you probably saw this slide before because it's a standard slide, is based on these pillars. Global, regional, and bilateral agreements are the documentation that you have. These are verified by IAEA, the International Safeguards Agency safeguards, and also by regional safeguards, as we will see as we move on. In addition to that, we have a very strong export control system in place now, and we'll see how this became stronger as the years went by. And this export control system controls the supply and transfer of nuclear material and technology, and also a very strong physical protection pillar, which is, as the name implies, it protects from seizure, theft, and other criminal activities. So none of this exists by itself these days. When years ago, we could still see groups of the physical protection people and the people that implement international safeguards. As the years go by, we have seen, especially in my area, in technical collaboration, all of the agreements that have been in place to implement safeguards measures are expanding to incorporate physical protection as well. Organizations, the nuclear organizations, always have the safeguards and the physical protection departments or groups under the same leadership. So the way that I'd like to describe the regime, the international nonproliferation regime, is as a puzzle. And if you think about history, each year or each event would be a piece of this puzzle that we have to put together and building it in order to make it stronger and make it complete. The building blocks that I listed here are the legal instruments that allow this puzzle to be put together. So these are just a little names that I use, and a lot of people use the same names, to be honest. But it gives you an idea of the whole, and that the pieces do not exist by themselves. They are linked to each other. So the nonproliferation regime is not only, and some people make that mistake of relating it exclusively to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. The regime, as the name implies, is formed by multiple treaties, agreements, conventions. So think of it as the real puzzle with all the little pieces. But the NPT is obviously a very, very ground and a very important piece, perhaps the largest one, I would say. But the regime also includes treaties, conventions, arrangements, and even, bilateral collaboration agreements that serve to strengthen and to reach the same goal in the end. Those are physical protection. Export control plays a major role these days. Test ban treaties, fissile material production cutoff treaties, everything that means strengthening the peaceful use of nuclear energy. So let's go a little bit in time and talk a bit about how things started to evolve. One of the earlier attempts after the Second World War to regulate the use of nuclear energy was created within the United Nations system. And it was the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, back then UNAC, that was created in '46. And these countries were represented under the Security Council. So this was created a year after, less than a year after the UN system was created. So it was one of the first attempts to regulate the use of the technology. Then you've probably heard about the Baruch Plan, which suggested the creation of an International Atomic Development Authority. And you'll see how these acronyms kind of all change the letters, but they all start with International Atomic. The elimination of the veto right to make this agency or this authority more democratic, I would say. But it fell into pieces after the former Soviet Union tested its first device in '49. The way that history has evolved, you can clearly see a reaction after an action. We are changing that in recent years. We are being more proactive, and that's a great thing. But for many years, until very recently, we've seen the international community reacting and then implementing a control measure based on something that has happened. And back in those days, the big events were obviously the testing of these nuclear devices. So when the former Soviet Union tested its first device in '49, this IADA fell into pieces. But the community, the international community, persisted in a search for controlling the use of nuclear energy for peaceful uses only, and bringing together all of the countries and trying to avoid, by all means, the nuclear arms race. The Atoms for Peace speech by President Eisenhower in 1953 was a major happening, and it's referred to as the really start of the International Atomic Energy Agency as it is today. It was called back then the International Agency for Atomic Energy, just a little play with names, still under the umbrella of the United Nations to give it legitimacy, of course. It was to be responsible for management of nuclear material and promote the peaceful applications of nuclear energy and to verify what these countries were doing in terms of using this material for peaceful purposes. So you'll see a lot of similarities of what the IAEA is today. At the same time, while this project was moving or being fine-tuned, the Europeans were also moving. So you can see the regions organizing themselves in terms of controlling or protecting themselves for any possible nuclear test. The Europeans is an example of that. Because they are regional, perhaps, it's because one of the reasons why they moved faster than the IAEA to be put together. But through the Treaty of Rome in 1957, the European community, or the European countries, established the Euratom, the European Atomic Energy Community. Basically, it's at a regional level the same responsibility that you see in other regional organizations and the IAEA, which is to ensure that nuclear material is not used by these European countries are not diverted to prohibited activities, undeclared or non-peaceful activities. They conduct verification, they conduct the same procedures that the IAEA does, but with a smaller environment, with a smaller number of countries, of course, and therefore communication is, I would say, much more effective, faster, and decisions are made on a more, expedite way. So that was in '57, but also in '57, a couple of months later, there you go. You have the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So they were contemporary. They happened at the same time. One moved a little faster than the other due to the number of parties involved. But it's very important that the IAEA was created in '57. Its statute was implemented in that year. And it started out with 81 countries and and today it's almost as universal as the UN members. You heard this in a previous presentation. I'm not going to spend much time to it, but the IAEA implements its safeguard system through different documentation. We call it the Information Circular 66, which was the first system that the agency implemented back in '61. It has evolved for several revisions, and basically what this document establishes is that the IAEA conducts verification in facilities. It's specific for a facility. It's not a full scope verification system. So in other words, it's negotiated by the agency and the state and its member state specifically for one type of facility, one process. And this was how the whole system started to be put together. Then another historical event happened that generated a reaction immediately, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis in Latin America, in the Caribbean. Those countries, Latin America and the Caribbean, decided to get themselves together and, at the example of the Europeans, establish a nuclear weapon-free zone. This is much broader than a safeguards agreement. This goes into not only peaceful uses of nuclear energy, but banning all of the tests in that region. So really freeing the region from any nuclear weapon or nuclear device, and testing in there. So one of the things that, this was probably one of the main reasons why you start seeing a lot of the regional countries getting together. Not only, we started with the Europeans, of course, but opening up the scope into a free weapon zone. 67 is the year of the Tlatelolco Treaty. It has recently come into full force, has fully been implemented. I just came back from a trip to South America and was informed that Cuba has put into force the treaty. So this was the last country that was holding the completely full implementation of the treaty. For many years, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile had made use of one of the articles that the treaty has to that foresees that countries will not test, and including those that have territories in the region. And of course that included France and England, until they signed a protocol committing not to conduct these tests. And that was also signed. So the treaty is full into force, and this is a great news for the world that we have Latin America and the Caribbean free weapon zone. Following the Cuba Missile Crisis in '62, the community again, and this had been in the works. This is not something that is accomplished within a year. But you have to have, we had these events happening to support the strengthening of the idea of implementing this universal treaty, which is the Nonproliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty, the NPT. Some call it the foundation of the nuclear nonproliferation regime. As I mentioned, there were other attempts that have to be considered. But the NPT, yes, it is the treaty that everybody refers to as I said, as the universal treaty. Well, it should be universal. We'll go a little bit down and see why it's not. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was one happening, one historical happening. Then you have the tests, the nuclear tests from France and China in 1960 and 1964. And a test ban treaty, the drafting of the idea of test ban between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Following that, we have these countries forming two blocks and saying, this is it. We don't want to, we tested, we have the capacity. We don't want to use this for weapons. We just want to move on into the peaceful uses. So you have the signature and ratification of the NPT in 68. I mean, in signature was open in 68. And it came into force after ratification by 40 states in 1970. Until the early 90s, we could say that we had 190 member states. As you all know, North Korea withdrew, so 189, that is the number of states that are members, signatories, and have the NPT in force for these countries. So what are the main objectives of the NPT? The stop spreading nuclear weapons, that's the main. So you have those 5 countries that are members, that are considered the nuclear weapon states. And after that, the treaty does not foresee anybody else, so everybody should stop spreading nuclear weapons or testing or so forth. There should be more collaboration between countries to promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and you see this a lot. And the IAEA was one of its roles in the very beginning was to foster this international collaboration for peaceful purposes. Very strong program in the early years of the IAEA. And one of the points that are still being discussed and this comes to a very highly political level, is the question of disarmament. So the treaty, at the same time that it stops the proliferation of nuclear weapons, it calls upon those who have nuclear weapons to disarm. The problems we have with the NPT is that these countries that are called to disarm, they don't have a deadline to disarm. So they are called by, they all testify that they will do it, but there's not a deadline. I would be very unfair to say that there's a huge program of disarmament going on for many years between the United States and the Soviet Union. But when you deal with these international agreements, you have to remember that you have those countries that are always going to be criticizing others. And it has been a political discussion for many, many years. Disarmament is one of the issues that is raised. The other topic that is also discussed is the fact that the NPT establishes these 2 groups of countries. So you have the countries that have nuclear weapon states, that have nuclear weapons, we call them the NWS, and the non-nuclear weapon states. And the goal of the NPT was very noble. I mean, it was supposed to allow the nuclear weapon states to share peaceful uses and technologies with the non-nuclear weapon states. But if we have seen some of that in practice, years will prove that it took a different route. We have a strong program of peaceful uses of nuclear energy, no doubt about that, but the transfer of technology to enrich, to reprocess, has been very much controlled. So I just mentioned this, I'm sorry. The concerns about the NPT are these two blocks of the haves and the don't haves. That's how we call them. Those countries that have nuclear weapons and those who don't. So the haves and the no haves, don't haves. The timetable to disarm, there's no deadline for that. Countries are disarming, and the United States and Soviet and Russia are in a very aggressive program towards that end, but a full disarmament has not been, the deadline has not been established. And this is criticized by the non-nuclear weapon states. And also the fact that the NPT it was intended to be a universal treaty, but it's not. And there is a very weakness, which is how easy it is for a country to withdraw from the treaty. And this is what we saw with North Korea. So in addition to the NPT, I want to really remember that we're not talking about one single instrument here. We're talking about a regime. So when you deal with a regime, you have to come in and put more action. So Chemical Weapons Convention is considered part of the regime, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty also considered as part of the big puzzle that I talked about in the very beginning. In addition to that, we have the Physical Protection Convention of Nuclear Material, which is already in its revision 5, I believe. And all of the regional treaties. This is a major point that we should be looking at. It's not so much the broad United Nations global concern. These regions are taking matters into their hands and really protecting themselves most of the time because they have the same culture, they have the same background, they have the same political interests. So these countries, they get themselves together, and we have the Treaty of Tlatelolco in place in South America and the Caribbean, Treaty of Rarotonga, Bangkok, Pelindaba in Africa, and 2 proposed ones in Central Asia and Southern Hemisphere. All of them proposing nuclear weapons-free zones. I mentioned about the export controls that were implemented. So the NPT has one of the mechanisms of export control in dealing with nuclear exports. And the Zanger Committee is the committee that falls under the NPT umbrella. Later on, we have the creation of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So let's see the Zanger Committee. It is an exporters committee, and it's, as I mentioned, it's related to the NPT commitments, and it generated what we call as the trigger list. This trigger list contains items, materials, equipment, everything that could be used for non-peaceful uses. So this trigger list is updated on a regular basis. And it's something that is used by the export control experts when we have some transfer of sources, of material, of equipment. These are the regulations that we have to go through when we, for example, deal with international collaboration. So just to give you an example, when we have a project that foresees shipping a certain equipment abroad or a certain spare part to upgrade a system, this will have to go through export control scrutiny and before we do the export. And they consider not only what the use is, what it's made of, what other uses this may have, this equipment or part may have. So it's a thorough investigation before we are allowed to export anything to another country. So in '74, another historical event happens. This picture is not of the Indian underground explosion, but I liked it because it shows a hole, and it's the best that I could find of an underground explosion. So this was the test site here in the United States. And again, this is just an illustration of what the underground site looks like. But India exploded or tested its device in 1974, but because the country is not a member of the NPT, you know, the community may scream, may, you know, talk about it, may document this in the Security Council because, yes, they are a UN member, but the fact that they are not signatories of the NPT does not classify them as violating any treaty. So the community has been dealing with this situation in other circumstances also. Israel, for example, Pakistan, they all fall under the same category. They go by the United Nations rules and regulations, but the fact that they're not signatories of the NPT does not bind them to any commitments as all of the other countries have. Although I must say that India has had verification agreements with the IAEA based on facilities. So that IMCIRC 66 type agreement that I mentioned before, specifically for one type of facility, India has been talking to, actually the international verification has been conducted in those facilities based on that type of agreement. But there's nothing full scope because India does not have the agreement in place with the agency. So following this test of India, the Nuclear Suppliers Group was created. Now this group was known as the London Group, and today it has about 47 countries. And it doesn't, different from the Zanger Committee that actually establishes a list of what can and cannot be exported, the NSG provides guidelines of how these exports can be conducted, what are the rules that need to be in place. They work closely with the IAEA in these guidelines and rules, and these guidelines recognize physical protection measures, safeguards agreements, and all of the provisions that a country has in place to prove the good intent of these transfers and exports. So it's a much broader concept. Actually, I wouldn't even compare the Zanger Committee with the NSG. It's a totally, although the goal is controlling export, the approach is different. The NSG members, they meet on a regular basis, and they adjust those guidelines also on a regular basis. So let's talk a little bit about international safeguards now that also falls under the NPT. Article 3 of the NPT calls upon the signatory state, member state of the NPT, to establish and implement international safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. This agreement is, the goal, of course, is preventing diversion of nuclear material and fostering peaceful uses of nuclear energy. International safeguards, this is something that you probably have seen before, and as I said in the beginning, do not think, oh, I'm seeing this again. I'm giving you what the policy agreement is calling for and how this is going to be implemented, and how the safeguards or peaceful uses of nuclear energy called upon the NPT is implemented is by means of international safeguards agreements signed between the country and the International Atomic Energy Agency, implementing verification activities in a country. So international safeguards are arrangements to account for and control nuclear material. They have a strong verification element that inspectors go to the facility to verify records and conduct technical measures, non-destructive, destructive, swipe samples, surveillance, you name it. And you have a very, and this is what, and back again, in my career, I always had the quality, the qualifying side of my profession. International safeguards comes as a quantification of those qualification measures that I had so strong in my academic background. So things started to justify themselves as I moved on and saw that these inspectors actually go to a facility to verify a commitment, a very strong, high-level commitment of a country. And I think this is the big beauty of the whole system, is that you have policy and technical working together for a common goal. And believe me, this was not clear years ago. I mean, professionals that came out of their universities, they either had the expertise on one area or the other. And they would not understand how both went together until you are thrown in your work, and you have to explain things, and you have to understand why this is being done. So one of the things that I did to help me transition into understanding what the technical measures were about was to ask questions. You know, you have to ask many questions. Why are you doing this? What are you finding out with this specific measure? And there's always an answer, and there's always a justification. So don't be afraid to ask questions of why are we doing this. So the safeguards inspections require a commitment from many groups. So you start out with those who sign the agreement, very high level, saying the country commits to open its facilities to inspections and to declare the use of its nuclear material and the operations of its facilities and so forth, everything that is established in the safeguards agreement. Then you have the operators of the facilities having to be committed to adjust their facilities to these inspections. They have to not only allow the inspectors to come, but they have to keep a very organized records of their movements and their production. These records are audited. They are sent to the national authority of these countries, which usually have control over all of the facilities and processes in the country. These records are then informed to the IAEA, and the IAEA comes and performs the international verification. Not only inspections, the IAEA, as you know, it uses containment and surveillance to allow continuity of knowledge because they cannot be there at the same time. So continuity of knowledge is a key component of international safeguards, and of course the goodwill of states who make this very important commitment to use and produce nuclear material for peaceful uses only. So the objective of safeguards, as you probably know already, is to deter the diversion of nuclear material from peaceful uses and to provide assurance to the international community that these signatory countries are effectively committed to implement the to implement and to honor its commitments of the NPT. So just these two objectives tell you that you have the political and the technical together. When you deter, you use technical measures. You verify. You use equipment, specific equipment. When you provide assurance, you are concluding the results of these technical measures, and you are providing the international community with a statement that says there has been no evidence of nuclear diversion in such and such country, and so forth. So both policy and technical work hand in hand all the time. I'm not going to dwell much on this because I already mentioned. So nuclear safeguards, material accountability, physical security, because you have to protect the entry and access to facilities, and also continuity of knowledge provided by containment and surveillance, locking doors and lids and everything that could divert, could result in a way that you can divert material. You use all of these systems. We're back again into the policy. You see, I go back and forth just to give you a very clear idea that in the real world, you have to consider these two aspects all the time. It's not because I am dealing with international collaboration projects and I am implementing a surveillance system in a facility abroad that I don't have in the back of my mind what the goal of that instrument is. So all the time you have to think that these countries are sovereign states to start with. They have made a commitment to the peaceful uses, and then you are assisting or you are implementing or you are verifying with a technical means. India, Pakistan, and Israel, they are not members of the NPT, but they have specific safeguards applied to relevant plants. Remember, I mentioned the specific safeguards agreements or verification agreements that these countries have with the IEA, the Insert 66 type agreements. And the IEA obviously regularly visits these countries for those specific records. Then comes another historical event. South Africa decides to open up its program, and in 1991 it becomes a member of the NPT, a signatory, I would say, of the NPT, and in 93 it just discloses a whole nuclear weapons program to the whole world. And this early 90s, and this is when we're going to see a shift of verification measures that the international community is going to be putting into place. One of the outcomes of this event was extending the NPT indefinitely. This was a major happening at that time because the NPT had to be, the signatory countries had to gather every so often to decide if the NPT would be extended for so many years. After this event in South Africa, the community decided to extend the NPT indefinitely. So that was a good strengthening measure of the treaty. In the same time frame, early 90s, the two South American countries that had their nuclear programs, most advanced nuclear programs, Brazil and Argentina, and the complete nuclear fuel cycle, decided to join forces and avoid and declare that all of its activities would be subject to international verification. They started this at the example of the Europeans, and they established a bilateral agency called the Brazilian-Argentine Agency for Accounting and Control, the agency that I worked for 11 years. So I was a member of the first staff of ABAC. So I saw how I witnessed and I participated in all of these discussions prior to its creation, as a matter of fact. And all of the years that we took to implement international safeguards in the region and to work together with the IAEA. Because the IAEA is always involved. It's involved with Euratom, it's involved with ABAC, it's involved with the countries, other countries. ABAC serves as the communication channel between the Brazil and Argentina and the agency. But its role is much broader than just the communication. It is the regional system for accounting and control, just as Euratom is. And because it's regional, the idea of close collaboration and close communication between the two countries is very strong. The idea of resolving issues on a very timely manner is one of the very strong characteristics of the regional system. Taking matters in their own hands and really resolving any issue that come up without causing it and without making it a big problem for the IAEA. So at the example of Euratom, there was a common system of accounting and control implemented between both countries, and guess what? The purpose is to verify that nuclear materials declared in all of its activities is not diverted for non-peaceful uses. Same objective with a smaller scope of implementation. But not everybody's peaceful or do not make their activities transparent enough to the agency so that the agency can conclude its peaceful purposes. So we've seen countries such as Iran, Iraq, North Korea not being so open and transparent, and that has generated some thought on the weaknesses of the system. And again, unfortunately, for every action there is a reaction. We are seeing that the process is reverting. We're finally getting into the action before, we're actually getting into the process of reaction before the action, if that makes any sense. But for the early 90s, we were still reacting to events and actions that countries have implemented. And this was the case with Iraq, as you all know. That generated what we have called the additional protocol. So there was a transition back in the early 90s of what we had called for many years as traditional safeguards. This terminology is gone. We don't talk about traditional safeguards anymore because we have evolved so much. But the traditional safeguards is what the system called for, verifying the declarations of the members of the state. So simple as that. The state would declare what they have and what they do, and the agency would verify. There were some hidden activities that were not foreseen, and that caused the system to make some changes. And that's when we see the additional protocol coming into force. Now, what is the additional protocol? Well, the additional protocol is, as its name implied, additional to the international safeguards agreement that a country has in place with the IAEA. And it goes beyond the declared nuclear material. It goes into well, let me just look into this slide first, because the next slide is the one that I'm going to explain more about the additional protocol. So 93 was the year that the agency started a program that they called 93+2, which ended up being 93 plus 5, I think. But anyway, it was the program that looked into how the agency would strengthen its safeguard system. The outcome of this was there are measures that the agency can implement based on its powers under the safeguards agreement with the country, but there are others that they cannot, and it is highly recommended that the country provide that information so that the agency can have a whole picture of what's happening in the country. And those are obviously research, development, and not necessarily nuclear material activities. So we have, this is documented, of course, the model protocol additional to the agreements between the states and the IAEA. They negotiate, the countries and the IAEA negotiate this protocol, this model, to its, the verbiage is mostly the same. You may have some details that can be changed on a case-by-case basis. So 97 is the year that the additional protocol came into force through INFCIRC 540. Okay? So as I mentioned, this document allows the IAEA to perform additional activities, verification activities in a country, and to have a more broad and complete understanding of the program in that country, and the nuclear program in that country. So yeah, I mentioned that already. So part of it is what you can implement with the existing legal framework that the IAEA has, and the other was conferred to the additional protocol. The additional protocol is agreed on a case-by-case basis. So each non-weapon state agrees with the IAEA. However, remember the haves and the non-haves? With the additional protocol, we see an interesting movement, a positive movement from the nuclear weapon states, which is they provide on a voluntary basis their own additional protocol. So, for example, the United States has implemented its additional protocol through which it puts into, it voluntarily declares to the IAEA some of its activities. And I think that's very important because regardless of what information you are providing, you are sending the message across the border that it doesn't matter if you have nuclear weapons or if you don't have nuclear weapons. What is happening in your research laboratories, what is happening in your civilian program should be a matter of concern of your intent in the future. So I see the additional protocol as an instrument that is quite democratic in the way that it is bringing nuclear weapon states into the same objective of nonproliferation and declaring what they have in their civilian programs. So how the additional protocol will, what does it actually, what's its content? Basically, the IAEA has much more information on the nuclear and nuclear-related activities of the country. Once a country signs the AP, it includes declaration of what is in their research and development program, its production of uranium and thorium, regardless of whether it's commercialized or not, and also information on its imports and exports. On the other hand, the IAEA will also have much more access and greater rights to inspect a country. This can be done in short notice inspections, and they can make full use of some technologies such as environmental sampling and remote monitoring techniques, which was also mentioned in previous presentations. Some countries question that this right of access, this increased right of access, is something that should be considered negative. The process is not as simple as we think. I mean, in the diplomatic world, there's a lot of conversation that goes on. There's a lot of exchange of notes, and before you actually come into an agreement. Yes, the provision of the additional protocol is these short notice inspections or complementary access, in which the inspector goes to a facility for a safeguards inspection, and they say, well, that building over there, what do you have in there? I want to have complementary access. Although it sounds simplistic, but that complementary access is negotiated as well. I mean, although the inspection may ask, I'm going to ask for a complementary access, but he or she has already cleared that request with the IAEA. So it's not something that comes out of, out of the blue. And this is a very important point, because it sounds, the whole system sounds very simplistic, but there's a lot of coordination that takes place before an inspection happens, or even in this case in any call for a complementary access. So there's a very close coordination with the IAEA, between the state and the IAEA, for all of these verification activities. One of the things that the IAEA always had problems with was visas. Some countries, and because the International Atomic Energy Agency has their inspections are multicultural, they come from different countries. Some countries don't have diplomatic relations with others, and yet the IAEA inspector is an international officer that has the right to go into that country. So visas were always a big problem. We faced this when I worked for ABAC during those years, with inspectors that didn't have a visa to Brazil. And how do you go about that? Well, first of all, it is a commitment of the country, right, of the state, to allow these inspectors to come in. So they should be providing long-term visas for these individuals. Through the additional protocol, and because of the short notice inspections and complementary access inspections, this visa renewal process or visa issuance process has to be made much more simpler. I mean, what was simple before has to be almost automatic. And I'm sure that these countries that signed the additional protocol expedite and have worked with the agency on these. The way that this is done, of course, is the IAEA provides a list of inspectors to the member states, and the member state know who can come to inspect. And based on that list, which is approved by the country, the agency provides a list that includes a physicist and a photographer. Well, the country goes and says, and why are we going to accept this photographer? What is it going to come? So this is an example of coordination, and it starts at the very first level, which is communicating who is coming to my country. And so the states have all the information necessary to expedite this entry process. And those, so far, we have about 39 countries to date that have approved and signed the additional protocol. So we finally got into the reaction before the action happens. And one of the things that shook the international community a lot was the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540 back in 2004. Before this resolution that I'm going to talk about, countries had the choice to either become signatory of the NPT and therefore go through all of the commitments that it requires, that it calls upon, or not, right? But when the Security Council took matters into their own hands, it became law. It became an international obligation for all of its members to submit or to abide by this resolution. So, before 1540, we had a few resolutions that controlled the export controls, basically, documented export controls. 1373 dealt with financing of 1373 called the attention for the problem of terrorism and illegal arms and illegal sources of nuclear material going across borders internationally and possibly generating some terrorist activities. And then we had 1373 resolutions in 2001 and following 1377, which probably dealt, if I'm not wrong, they dealt with the financing of how these materials and would come about. So some raising awarenesses, these resolutions prior to 1540. But 1540, it was adopted in 2004, and it actually calls upon all of the UN member states to have, and the words are quite strong in this resolution, to have laws and enforcement capacity for non-proliferation export controls and the protection of controls of sensitive materials. So while other nuclear UN Security Council resolutions, they raise the awareness and they discuss the issue and they call upon, to a certain extent, to countries to implement measures. 1540 is a milestone in the sense that countries must have these laws and enforcement capability. And this, the community is currently adjusting to this instrument as it has been with the NPT, as it has been with the International Safeguards Agreement, as it has been with the additional protocol. It's one more piece of, it's one more of those building blocks, those legal instruments that the regime uses to strengthen itself. So the resolution aims at preventing weapons of mass destruction to proliferate, because it will be regulating the transportation and export mechanisms. It will also counter and prevent terrorist acquisition, because these materials are supposed to be very well controlled by the state. So what we see here is a very strong call to the states, to the member states, to take action, to take a very strong responsibility. During the past years, you had the IAEA as the big responsible entity, or ABAC or IRATM, those regional systems, as the responsible for implementing. But this resolution calls the attention that, hello, member states, you have the responsibility in your hands. It all starts with you. If you have these measures, these laws, these enforcement capabilities in place, we can all work together better. My final remarks for this presentation, I want to call the awareness of you again, and you probably saw this talk and some of these topics repeated over and over again. I'm not going to apologize because this is the way that we learn. But one of the things that we have to be aware of is that international safeguards is not only technical. The political component is tremendous. The economic component is tremendous. I mean, these countries, some of these countries are producing nuclear energy. Therefore, they have to have reactors. Some of these countries need the fuel to go into the reactors. Therefore, they go and build their fuel fabrication plants. The material that goes into the fuel rods, sometimes they need to be enriched, sometimes they're natural. So you have justification for enrichment plants. It's all about what is the country's economic needs. And this is fine as long as the country follows its peaceful uses committed through all of these legal instruments. So the technical part is linked to the policy part, which has a need, a goal, or a economic need for that, and also a social aspect, which is basically called upon by employment and basically employment, I would say. The NPT, there has always been the skeptical people that says, oh, the NPT is just another instrument. But the fact of the matter is that for all these years, we thought that the NPT, I mean, in the beginning, before it even happened, we thought that we would probably have almost 35 nuclear weapon states by now. And the fact is that the NPT has served a major purpose in controlling that spread of nuclear weapon and of nuclear weapon states, regardless of its weaknesses that we talked about, the fact that it generates two separate blocks, the haves and the non-haves, the fact that there's no deadline commitment to disarmament, and the fact that it's considerably easy to withdraw from the treaty. Still, all the mechanisms that are in place in addition to the NPT, or to strengthen and to implement the commitments of the NPT, they come together to control the spread of nuclear weapons and promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So the next step, and this is the topic of my next presentation, would be how these state and regional systems are becoming so important for international safeguards, and what is the state level approach that the agency the IAEA is implementing, currently implementing. So we will see, as part of my reaction before the action, a call for states to take matters into their own hands in terms of allowing more communication with the agency, or implementing more communication with the agency, allowing field trials, allowing installation of remote monitoring systems, allowing sharing of information on a more regular and even beyond what the safeguards agreements call upon, and by beyond I mean on a voluntary basis. So all of this is taking place at this moment, current time, in the international community. Several presentations, several meetings, all of them discussing what is this state level approach that the IAEA is implementing. I'm not going to dwell much on this because this is a whole subject of a totally separate presentation, and I'm available for questions if you have any. Thank you very much.